I don't know if any of you have budding authors in your life. Actually, when I was sitting out in the rotunda, I was editing Colt's short story, and it's all about a heroic mouse that goes on a quest to bring food and seeds back to his starving city. I think maybe there is going to be another writer in our family. But if you do have a budding writer who's an acquaintance of yours, I'm going to give you an important piece of advice. If they're writing murder mysteries, do not make them mad. Because we have our ways of getting even. My first 9 books were original paperbacks featuring my detective, J.P. Beaumont. My first hardback was Hour of the Hunter. I spent 5 years as a K-12 librarian on the Tohono O'odham Reservation west of Tucson. I told 26 stories a week in K-6 classrooms. And many of the stories and legends I told on the reservation were the stories and legends of the Tohono O'odham people, the desert people. And so you will find those stories and legends woven into the background of all of the Walker books. There are 5 of them now. And when I say woven, I do mean woven. The Beaumont books are written in the first person through J.P. Beaumont's point of view. This was my first non-first person book. And I sort of went overboard. This is told through 7 or 8 different points of view with this elastic time zone, a timeline that goes back and forth over 70 years. And writing this book was more like weaving a blanket than it was writing a book. I took the legends and they just slipped right into the story in this magical way. It was really amazing. But the main character in this book, Diana Ladd, is a woman who's a teacher on the reservation, but she really wants to be a writer. Like me, she had a husband who was allowed in the creative writing program that was closed to her. Her husband is dead at the beginning of the book. And the crazed killer turns out to be a former professor of creative writing from the University of Arizona. So by all means, do not make mystery writers mad. And you know, of all of my books, I seldom reread books that I've written because by the time you've written them and edited them and re-edited, I'm usually so sick and tired of them that I never want to touch them again. But this book, if I have to look up something in this book, this one will suck me in and I'll end up reading the whole damn thing. I thought I'd start today by telling you how I met J.P. Beaumont. He was my first character, my first real character, and I wrote a book in Seattle. Once I moved to Seattle, I wrote a book called By Reason of Insanity. It was a thinly fictionalized true crime story of my first husband's and my encounter with a serial killer in Tucson, Arizona in 1970. It never sold to anybody because, for one thing, it was 1,400 pages long. If you write a book that's 1,400 pages long, you have essentially written 3 complete novels. And By Reason of Insanity never sold to anybody, but it was necessary to write it because it was on-the-job training. In the course of writing that very long book, I taught myself how to do pacing and dialogue and plotting and descriptive scene setting. And I learned all of those things by writing that book that was never published. And it will never be published. It was not ready for prime time. But it is with my papers at the University of Arizona Library Special Collections. And by the way, when the University of Arizona awarded me an honorary doctorate of humane letters, it was really hard to sit there and not giggle. It wasn't the English department who awarded it, by the way. It was the library, because, of course, I'm a recovering librarian. So I wrote that book, and I found an agent, and she tried to sell the book. Nobody would ever buy it. And the editors that turned it down told her that the stuff that was fiction was fine, and the stuff that was real was unbelievable and would never happen, even though it had already happened. So she suggested that I write something that was entirely fictional. By the way, my kids refer to Alice as Aunt Alice. She didn't sell my first book, but she sold all of them since then, and a contract for 2 more books turned up this week. So she's still selling my books. And I think beginning writers sometimes make a terrible strategic mistake. If they happen to land an agent with their first manuscript, if the agent doesn't manage to sell that book, they fire the agent and keep the manuscript. I did the opposite. I fired the manuscript and kept the agent. And the agent at that time said, okay, why don't you try writing something that's totally fiction? Well, I had an idea for a book, and I spent 6 months trying to write it. There was one character in particular, Anne Corley, that came into focus, but I couldn't make the book gel. It just wouldn't work. So in the spring of 1983, when spring break came around, I sent the kids to Camp Ocala for 5 days, and then I put myself on a train to go down to Portland and spend some time with a friend from my days in the life insurance business. So I got on the train at the King Street station with a stack of blue line notebooks and a fistful of ballpoint pens. And I was sitting there waiting for the train to leave. And this handsome, sort of middle-aged guy got onto the train, sat down across from me, and introduced himself as J.P. Beaumont. Now, it turns out he was somebody I knew because Anne Corley had been telling me about him for 6 months. And she said she thought I'd kind of like him. And so he said he was a homicide detective with Seattle PD, and he was working the murder of a homicide with a murdered child as the victim. And you know how in the comics all of a sudden a light bulb comes over? That was my light bulb moment. I got a pen, I got a blue line notebook, and I began to write. And I wrote, "She might have been a cute kid once. That was hard to tell now. She was dead." And as soon as I wrote those words, I was at the crime scene with J.P. Beaumont. I was walking in his shoes. I was seeing what he saw. I was hearing what other people said to him, hearing what he said to them. But I was also hearing what was going on in his head. And J.P. Beaumont and J.A. Jance have been character and author for going on 40 years now. I understand that Agatha Christie, my idol, became increasingly disenchanted with her character Hercule Poirot and was eager to write him out of her books. But I still like J.P. Beaumont. And when I settled in to write this latest book, Beaumont number 24, within a few pages, I was back in his world, back in his mindset, hearing what he said aloud, hearing what he was smart enough not to say aloud. And it was like putting on a comfy bathrobe and sitting down in front of a fireplace. It was like coming home. And it was really fun to write this book. But when I started writing about Beaumont, first person, point of view, he's a cop. I had never been a cop, never been an attorney. Everything I know about interviewing suspects comes from raising teenage children. They have no rights, by the way. He was a Seattle native. I had lived in Seattle less than 2 years. So I had to do a lot of research to make those things work. And I was writing through a male point of view. I'm not a man either. And so that was challenging. But he couldn't work all the time. He had to do something besides work. Well, I spent 18 years with my husband, who died of chronic alcoholism at age 42, a year and a half after I divorced him. 42 is pretty young. You've got to work really hard to be able to die of booze at that age. And I wasn't allowed in the creative writing program, so nobody ever told me out loud, write what you know. But I knew a lot about drinking. And so Beaumont did the kind of drinking that I had lived with for all those years. So the fourth Beaumont book came out, a book called Taking the Fifth. If I had a brain, I would have named the fifth book Taking the Fifth, and it would be easier to remember the numbers. And the fifth in the title has nothing to do with the Fifth Amendment. It has everything to do with Seattle's Fifth Avenue Theater. And at the time I was writing this book, my nephew, Dale Lane, was the head carpenter at the Fifth Avenue. Dale Allen Lane is his name. And the dedication says, today at DAL, if all the world's a stage, then God must be the head carpenter. And one of the characters in this book is named Alan Dale, after my nephew, Dale Allen. When I put the drinking into the books, I didn't attach any particular importance to it. It was just sort of stage business. But I was signing Taking the Fifth at a mall in Portland. I was inside the mall, but I was outside the B. Dalton store. Remember B. Dalton's? And I was seated outside with my books spread out on a card table. And a lady came up to the table and she said, Beau drinks every day. He has a drink of choice, and it is starting to interfere with his work. Does J.P. Beaumont have a problem? I said, you know, these are books. But in the course of that series of signings, 6 other people asked me the same question. And I finally figured out denial is not just a river in Egypt. My readers had already figured it out. I was the last person to notice. So that's how Beau has his first blackout in book number 7. Well, he's had blackouts before, but this one he couldn't exactly dodge because he hurt his hand and he didn't know how. In book number 8, he's in treatment. This is book number 24. So he's been sober for a lot more books than he was drinking. And I still have people who tell me they liked him better when he was drunk. I worry about those folks. But that part of the story has had an interesting ripple effect. When I do signings, the author seated at the table is always sort of a target, especially if there are any nutcases in the room. I don't see anybody like that here today. You all look like very nice people. My first experience with that was this guy who came waltzing up to the table and said, "Are you the lady who writes the murder mysteries?" And I said, "Yes." He said, "I've just been acquitted of murdering 7 people. Do you want to write my book?" No, thank you. I told him I didn't do true crime. Maybe he should talk to Anne Rule. She was not amused. Because the guy really did kill those people. He locked them in a fishing boat and burned it to the waterline. And he got out on a technicality. So I was in Texas at the Texas Festival of Books. And I've now developed the ability to keep an eye on what's going on around me so I'll know what's coming. And I could see this guy standing in line grinning at me from ear to ear, and I thought, oops. Yep, he's going to be the one. Well, there were a lot of people between him and me. And when he got right in front of the table, I realized that he was pushing a stroller with a toddler in it, a little girl who was probably 2-3 years old. And I said, "Hi, my name is Rob. I first started reading your books in Rose Hill Junior High in Redmond, Washington." Rose Hill is actually the school where Colt goes now. He said, "As soon as I read my first J.P. Beaumont book, I knew I wanted to be a cop." He graduated from high school. He enlisted in the Army. The whole time he was in the Army, he served as an MP. He said when he got out of the Army, he was a roaring alcoholic, but he still wanted to be a cop. So he got hired by this small jurisdiction somewhere in central Texas. They sent him to the police academy. And he said, "On the day I graduated from the academy, I realized that if I was ever going to be the kind of law enforcement officer J.P. Beaumont is, I had to get sober." So he went directly from the academy to treatment. And when I met him, he had just been appointed police chief in that little town. But he said, "I came today because I wanted to introduce you to my daughter. Her name is Morgan. My wife wouldn't let me name her JP." But that child has a completely different existence because her father read my books when he was in junior high. If that isn't astonishing, I don't know what is. Okay, so I know you wanted to hear about sins of the fathers, and I guess I'll tell you about that. Otherwise, the library you might end up asking the library for your ticket money back, right? When I started writing this book, I knew it had something to do with a previous book in this series, and it really had to do with book number 4, Taking the Fifth. And as I said, I hardly ever reread my books. This book was published in 1987. But because it was going to be connected to Sins of the Fathers, I felt it was necessary to reread the whole thing, and I did. It was published in 87, so it was written in 86. And when I opened it and started reading it, I was shocked because we were all so politically incorrect back then. Bo says things in this book that he'd be tarred and feathered for in this day and age. But that's not all. Bo hadn't sobered up. He was still drinking a lot back in those days, and he was still doing some pretty questionable stuff. And when he hopped into bed for a one-night stand with a perfect stranger, I was astonished, because that's not the J.P. Beaumont I know and love these days. He's sober now. He's mended fences with his kids. He has a new wife. He has a new life. But I read it, and then I started writing the book. When I write books, especially when I write a book that's in a long-running series, I have to be cognizant of the fact that some people who pick up this book will never have read a book about that character before. So I have to write enough of a complete book so they have enough of the backstory that they feel as though they're at home with those characters. I don't want to tell them so much of the backstory that they won't feel compelled to go back and read earlier books. And in the meantime, I can't include so much of the backstory that my regular readers are bored to tears. So it's sort of like walking a tightrope without a net. I have a lot of characters. I have a big family. I have a husband. My second husband, the good one, he says my first husband was so bad that it's made his life perfect. He says, yeah, he set the bar real low. So I have a husband. I have 5 kids. I have 10 grandkids. I have 1 going on 3 great-grandkids, because my 23-year-old granddaughter is expecting twins 3 weeks before her son Noah turns 2. Her life is going to be hell. Her husband is delighted. He is not going to be at home with 3 kids under the age of 2. I may have to have a talk with him. I can scare him. So that's a lot of birthdays to remember. Well, then if you include all the ages and birthdays of all of these characters in all of these books, it just becomes impossible. So I cheated with J.P. Beaumont. I gave him my birthday, and we will both turn 75 on the 27th of October. Because that way, not only do I know how old he is, I also know the eras he's lived through, because our histories are similar. So Bo is living his new life. He is in Bellingham, Washington. They still have the condo in Seattle, but he's living in Fairhaven outside of Bellingham. Mel is working as police chief, and he is trying to adjust to being a house husband, and he's not very good at being a house husband. And he misses being a sworn police officer. And what's helping him through this transition is having a dog in his life. Now, Bo grew up as the son of an unwed mother from World War II. Her fiance was killed in a motorcycle crash when J.P. Beaumont was already in process, but they hadn't exactly tied the knot. So he was the son of an unwed mother. She supported the family by working as a seamstress. They lived in an apartment over a bakery. So Bo never had a pet. He never had a goldfish. He never had a cat, and he certainly never had a dog. Until the last book, Proof of Life, when a dog showed up in his life, and supposedly on a temporary basis. But There may be people who can temporarily foster a dog and not give them up. I'm not that person, by the way. So he has Lucy. People say, well, where do you get your characters from? Well, Lucy comes from two decidedly different points in the universe. In the late 80s, our two sons, Bill J. and Tom, were going to Washington State University in Pullman, with two sons going to Wazoo. By the way, we call Washington State University Wazoo, and the University of Washington is UW. With two sons going to Wazoo, it was cheaper for us to buy a used mobile home for them to live in than it was to pay for apartments for both of them. So when we bought the mobile home, the carpet was pretty bad, so we installed new carpeting. Bill J. went to school. He broke up with his long-term girlfriend. He was lonely. He went to the pound. He got a puppy. They brought the puppy home for Thanksgiving. Now, I knew that if it was up to these two young men to housebreak this puppy, the carpeting was doomed. So I said, okay, here's the deal. Leave the puppy here with me. Between Thanksgiving and Christmas, I will housebreak the puppy, and you can take him back after Christmas. They said fine. So Boney stayed with us. He was really a scrawny little outfit. And so Boney stayed with us. And he was so small that I could carry him up and down the stairway in one hand when I was taking him out at night. Then he came to live with us, and he began to grow. And when he was about 6 months old and about this tall, my husband threw a tennis ball. There's no point in telling people don't throw balls in the house, because they'll do it anyway. So Bill threw a ball, and Boney went galloping after it, crashed into a brass and glass table, and broke one of his canine teeth. So we went to see our vet, Dr. $80. I'm sure he had a last name. I don't remember it. Because it didn't matter how many dogs you took there or what it was always $80. So I asked Dr. $80, I said, what kind of a dog do you think this is? And he said, well, it's a black and tan Canardly. I said, really? What kind of a dog is that? I thought it was something really exotic. He said, well, you can hardly tell what kind of a dog that is, but I think he's half German Shepherd and half Irish Wolfhound. And that's the problem with pound puppies. You don't know what they're made of. And by the time Boney finished growing, he could stand flat-footed with his chin on the table, but he never took anything off the table, and here's why. Dr. $80 said, okay, he's got to have a root canal or all of his teeth are going to flop over sideways. But I don't do root canals. And here is a very expensive doggy dentist who does. So we took Boney there and we dropped him off. And several hours later, when we came back to pick him up, the doggy dentist came out and read us the absolute riot act. He said, this dog is very vicious. You need to have him put down immediately. Because he had tried to do Boney's root canal without having him properly anesthetized. Well, try that on me and see what happens. I'll bite you too. So we went back to Dr. $80, and we said, what do we do? He said, well, you know, Boney was too small to be away from his mommy, to say nothing of being in the pound. And he is an insecure dog, and insecure dogs can be dangerous dogs. So you need to take him to the Academy for Canine Behavior in Bothell, Washington, put him through a month of boot camp, and they will teach him how to be a dog. And so we did, and they did, and we had Boney for 11 years. Now, the Academy for Canine Behavior is a very real place. Uh, they, if you adopt a dog, they will keep the dog for a week and for free to assess whether or not it is a good pick for a to live in a family. And our daughter and grandson adopted a dog named Snowflake, who was advertised as a great family dog. But she was 7 years old. She had been a puppy mill mommy. She had lived her whole life in a wooden shed. Her hind legs were so weak she couldn't stand on tile. She was terrified of everything. Everything. She was scared of hairspray and flushing toilets. And the academy helped our daughter bring Snowflake around. But when my daughter took her to the beach, she thought it would be fun, and the dog just bolted. So she got the dog. She had a baby. The hotel kept the baby while she and the police department tracked down the dog. And she picked Snowflake up on Friday, took her to the academy on Monday morning, and they kept her for a week, and they said, leave her for another week and let's see. This dog is so shut down, I don't know if she's ever going to make it. So at the end of the second week, Jance and Colt went back, and they brought the dog into the waiting room. And she looked at my daughter, climbed up into her lap. And the people at the academy said, how long did you have this cat dog before you brought her here? And she said, well, we had her for 36 hours. She said, obviously, this is your dog. And they still have Snowflake. And, okay, so back to Boney. I'm sorry. When we had to caravan up and down I-5 and I-10 to take kids back and forth to school, we had 3 cars, and we would have one dog in each car. And Boney rode in the back seat of our car with his chin on Bill's shoulder. Well, Boney was so big that his head completely obscured Bill, so cars would be passing us on the freeway. Because it looked for all the world like a dog was driving the car. So then Jance and Colt were looking for another dog. They hadn't found anything that worked. And they lived next to sort of in the neighborhood of kind of a ritzy tennis club. And so those people, once they lose a tennis ball, they never bother to go out looking for them. So Colt patrols the weeds around the tennis club, and they gather up tennis balls, put them in a box, and whenever they're on vacation, they go to the nearest shelter and drop off a box of tennis balls. So they went to a shelter. Colt was walking through the enclosures, and he put his hand on the glass of an enclosure that held this little puppy, 20-pound puppy. And the dog came over and put her paw on the other side of the glass. So naturally, Stormy Girl went home with Jance and Colt for that day. They had her for almost 5 years. Last December, they picked the dogs up from doggy daycare, and the counselor said, I think Stormy broke her dew claw, so maybe you should take her to the vet. Jance took her to the vet. They ran some tests, and the vet came out and said, I think this dog has developed what's called canine melanoma. And my daughter said, do not say another word. Well, the doctor said, it's just this. And she said, really? If you say another word, I am going to faint. And if you try to help me, Stormy will eat you alive. So as I was finishing writing this book, we lost Stormy Girl. She was in hospice, what was the equivalent of doggy hospice from then until later this spring. And that's why in Sins of the Fathers, you'll find part of the dedication is in memory of Stormy Girl. But that's where Lucy's really soul-freezing, black-eyed stare comes from. The kids have a 6-foot fence around their wooden fence, and Stormy could stand on her hind legs and peer over the top of the fence, and people outside would say, "What the hell is that?" There was no problem with burglaries in their house when they had Stormy Girl. Now they have a new dog. His name is Apollo. He is plug ugly. He's a dog only a boy could love. And if you remember Scooby-Doo, that's exactly what Apollo looks like. But, so Beaumont, when this book starts, is out in the yard throwing frisbees. He had to learn to throw frisbees. There were no frisbees in Ballard when he was growing up in the 50s. So they're out throwing frisbees in the morning, and Beau hears a car drive up to the house. Well, he knows how unsettling it is for visitors to be faced with this humongous dog. So he takes Lucy in the house and puts her on a stay on the rug command from the academy. And then he goes to answer the door. Now, before he answers the door, I have to tell you a story. As if I hadn't been doing that all along. 4 years ago in April, we went to see our doctor. And our doctor looked at my husband and said, "Use it or lose it. If you don't get started walking within the next 2 years, you are going to be riding around in an electric cart." And I knew that an electric cart would be tantamount to giving him the death sentence. So we went home the next day and we began walking. And at first, I could only walk 250 steps without having to sit down and rest. But for almost every day since then, I finally worked up to 10,000 steps, and I have walked 10,000 steps a day. I am not walking 10,000 steps a day while I'm on tour. My daughter says, "Mom, you're taking steps toward your fans. That counts." So I'm giving myself a pass right now. But we walked the 10,000 steps. We've changed a lot of our eating habits. And I am happy to tell you that I have lost 65 pounds. I have gone from a size 26 pants to a size 16. And it's really been a miracle. But our doctor is one of those guys, you give him an inch, he thinks he's a ruler. So the next time we went to see him, he said, "You need to start going to a gym." And I said, "Like bloody hell. You are not getting me into spandex for any amount of money." And so he found us a personal trainer. Dan comes to our house 3 days a week, and he puts us through a 30-minute workout. And most of the stuff he started us with are things you see on that Sit and Grow Fit program on PBS. And we don't have a lot of equipment. We don't have barbells. We walk in our yard. We walk around the pool deck. I have a 200 step lap. And at 200 steps, 5 laps, the thousands add up. And last week before I came on tour, I did 2 days where I did 8,000 steps in a row without having to sit down and rest at all. So between walking and having Dan there, it's made a big difference in our lives. So we recently sold our house in Tucson, but when we were being modified snowbirds, we would leave for Tucson when it started to rain in Seattle about the end of September. We'd stay down there until just before Thanksgiving. Then we'd go back to Washington and have Thanksgiving and Christmas with the kids, and then go back to Tucson for January, February, and March. So when March came around that first year, we came back. It was time for our workout. Dan rang the doorbell. Bill went to open the door. And when he opened it, there was Dan. Dan was 66 at the time. He was standing on the porch with an infant carrier with an infant in one hand and a pink diaper bag over the other shoulder. And Bill said, well, it looks like you've been busy. So Dan came in and he told us his story. His daughter is a 30-something drug addict. Her boyfriend, the father of the baby, is a drug addict who's in and out of jail. His daughter is still married to a guy who's been in prison for the last 5 years. The daughter got pregnant, had a baby, abandoned her drug-addicted newborn in the hospital. Dan was called to Seattle Children's Hospital and spent most of the next 3 months spending every night at the hospital, nursing the baby through withdrawal, getting her body weight up to the point where she could be safely released from the hospital. People that age aren't built to take care of newborn babies. He had terrible dark circles under his eyes. He lost 20 pounds, but he cared for that baby. Divorced, 66-year-old man, cared for that baby by himself for the next 9 months. She is now 3.5. She's living in Spokane with the woman, a relative who intends to be her adoptive mother. But the adoption has not yet gone through. You want to know why? The state is trying to reunite that family. And the mother's husband, the guy who's been in jail for 5 years, hasn't relinquished his parental rights, even though he is no biological relation to this child at all. The system is broken, and what the system needs is just a little bit of common friggin' sense. So Bo opens the door. And there's this guy standing there with an infant seat, with an infant in it in one hand, and a pink diaper bag over here. You see, I write a lot of books, but I'm too lazy to make up everything. If I wanted to invent the universe, my name would be Frank Herbert and I would write Dune. So I use what's available to me in real life. My husband maintains that I have a wearing blender in my head. And stuff goes into my head and it goes through the wearing blender, and when it leaks out through my fingers into the computer keyboard, it's a different story. And by the way, I could be a safecracker now because I no longer have any readable fingerprints. 60 books, 100,000 words per book. Yeah, fingerprints are gone. So the guy says to Bo, Detective Beaumont, and Bo said, well, I haven't been detective for a long time now, but do I know you? And the guy said, well, yes. I was the head carpenter on Jasmine Day's bus and drug show when it came through Seattle and the Fifth Avenue back in the 80s. And Bo said, oh yeah, I remember that. So he invites him in, offers him coffee, and the guy, Alan Dale, tells him his story. He has a daughter, drug addict, abandoned her newborn baby in the hospital. Alan has been appointed the baby's temporary guardian, but in order to become her legal guardian and be able to take the baby back home to Texas to raise it, his daughter has to relinquish her parental rights. And of course, she's MIA. So Alan Dale has come to Beaumont to ask him to hire him as a private investigator to track down his daughter. And Bo said, well, do you have a picture of this young woman. And so Allendale reaches in his pocket, gets out his wallet, brings out a school photo, and hands it to Beau, and Beau looks at it. Oopsie. Looks just like his daughter Kelly. You remember that one night stand in Taking the Fifth? Ha! Well, J.P. Beaumont just figured out you can't outrun your past. And that is how Sins of the Father start. And I'm not going to tell you how it ends. Sorry. You have to read it your own damn selves. Okay, now I have to. If you thought no, we're not done. We're not done. Believe me. If these people thought they were going to get in and out of here without a poetry reading, they're out of luck. I spent 18 years of my life with a man who died of chronic alcoholism at age 42. I told you that already. He always told me that when we had kids, he would stop drinking. So when my daughter was born, we lived between Tucson and Sells where we worked. Our house was on this little volcanic knoll west of the trading post at 3 Points. It was 30 miles from town in either direction, 2 miles off the highway, 7 miles to the nearest neighbor and or telephone. So it was sort of the boonies. So when it was time to have my daughter, he drove me into town. He dropped me off. I had the baby. 3 days later, he came back to get me, and he was roaring drunk. And I had this terrible choice. There were no car seats back then. Either I had to have him hold the baby and me drive, or me hold the baby and him drive. So he held the baby, and I drove myself home to the hill 3 days after giving birth to my daughter. But I was sort of mad by the time we got home. I said, you told me when we had kids you would stop drinking. That's what you promised. Here's the kid. It's time. Oh, okay. So he went into the house and he poured all of his booze bottles down the kitchen sink. But what I didn't know was the whole time I was in the hospital, he had been on a bender. And I was so naive that I had no idea how dangerous it could be for someone like that to go out booze cold turkey. So I spent the next 5 days on the hill with no telephone and no neighbors, with a newborn baby and a husband who was going through DTs. We couldn't turn off the lights because the bugs crawled on him. He sat at the dining room table playing chess with people I couldn't see. He insisted there were FBI agents down at the water hole eavesdropping on our conversations. And I kept thinking, okay, I can be strong because he's keeping his promise. 3 weeks later, some of his drinking buddies showed up. They popped the top off a can of Coors, handed it to him, and we were off and running again. Between 1972 and 1980, he was hospitalized 9 times for chronic alcoholism. In 1980, he turned up. Oh, and he told me, I remember, he said, if you'd have just had a boy. My son is 14 months younger than my daughter. In 1980, he turned up at my 6-year-old son's t-ball game in Tucson, in Phoenix, so drunk at 5 o'clock in the afternoon that when the game was over, he crawled on his hands and knees from the bleachers back to the car. And it was during that walk with my kids, their friends' parents, when I realized that I had to do something to save my children and save myself. So I got a divorce. I didn't get a divorce because I stopped loving him. I got a divorce because I had to save my life. But I knew that I still loved him, And if I stayed in Phoenix and he asked me, I would take him back. So I moved to Seattle. I started my new life. I started writing. In May of 1982, he was living in Phoenix. He was working construction. He broke his wrist. It was an on-the-job injury. So he had workman's comp coming in. He was living in a house that was owned by his mother, so he didn't have to pay rent or utilities. So he drank. He drank every day from May till November. And just before Thanksgiving, my first mother-in-law, Mary Grandma, called him up and said, guess what? I just scored a last-minute ticket. I'm going to come down to Phoenix from Las Vegas so we can have Thanksgiving dinner together. And in honor of her visit, without paying any attention to how much he had been drinking or for how long, he decided to sober up for her visit. They had Thanksgiving dinner together. At midnight, Thanksgiving night, a Tempe police officer found him lying in the middle of the street. And at first they thought he had been the victim of a hit and run. When they got him to Scottsdale Memorial, they discovered that he had gone into DTs. He was hospitalized with no kidney or liver function. So Mary Grandma was there. She was at the hospital with him. She had a 7th grade education, and the doctors were just walking all over her. So she finally called me in Seattle and asked me if I would speak to the doctors and try to get a straight answer. And I wrote this. It's called Death Sentence. He's dying. Words come through the wire and hammer home, despite the doctor's unctuous, cloying, unctuous tone. He's dying. I thought my tears exhausted years ago, and yet it hurts. Oh God, how much it hurts. He's dying. This is what I wanted when I thought a widow's garb would suit me better than a court's decree. He's dying. Should I go to him or stay away? What right have I to be there now? He's dying. I'll go. I flew down to Phoenix the day after Christmas, and I was there at the hospital with her and with him. On New Year's Eve, I took Mary Grandma out to dinner early, the senior special at Denny's. And then we went back to the hospital, and this is what happened. We keep a vigil by his midnight bed, his mother and his former wife, grieving for the man we loved and lost. It's harder for his mother than for me. I've already known the sting of loss. She's only now begun to see she cannot win. He's quiet now. A nurse comes in to loosen his restraints, not looking at the women waiting there. She knows. She doesn't want to say. The hours creep by. All stories are expended, yet we need some sound to hold the night at bay. Please sing, his mother asks me, and I do. It is a serenade of love, of songs we knew and treasured through the years, from bawdy barroom ditties to sweet hymns. The hours flow by. We hold his hands. I sing a line and wait to see if he will breathe again. He doesn't. It's over. Amen. I went back to Seattle. And I went to the strongbox to get out all of the documents you must present when someone dies. Marriage certificates, birth certificates, divorce decree. And there in the strongbox, I found all these pieces of paper that had little bits and pieces of poetry that I had been writing since the late 60s. At the time I was writing them, I thought I was being true to my art. He would be passed out cold in his recliner, and I was there on the hill by myself. So I would write out these bits of poetry. I thought I was being true to my art. I knew I wasn't being true to him because, remember, I wasn't supposed to be writing. So I hid the poetry away. He never saw it. But when I opened the strongbox and read through it, I could see I wasn't being true to my art. I was using words to deal with the central issues of my life. And I showed the poetry to somebody else, and they said, this needs to be a book. And it is this book. By the way, what's on the cover of this book is fireweed and only burns after a forest fire. It's my autobiography in poetry and prose. There are little essays that tell what was going on in my life when each of the poems were written. So it's sort of like going to a poetry reading, but you don't have to listen. But the title poem goes like this. I have touched the fire. It burned me, but I knew I lived. It seared me, but it made me whole. He called me. I went gladly, though I saw the rocks, fell laughing through the singeing air. I have known the fire. I'll live with nothing rather than with less. The flame is out. There is nothing left but ash. In the late 70s and early 80s, I was in Phoenix. I was selling life insurance. I was driving to appointment, struggling with the idea, was I going to get a divorce or not? If I did, would I be able to keep a roof over my children's heads? Would I be able to keep food on the table? So as I drove in my 78 Cutlass Supreme Chrome that he said I never should have bought and would never be able to pay for, I listened to the music of Gordon Lightfoot. Cobwebs and dust, cobwebs and dust. I hate to leave you, but leave you I must. And Helen Reddy, I am woman, hear me roar in numbers too big to ignore. And then there was the music of Janice Ian. The lyrics of some of her songs were just perfect for where I was at that time in my life. I was 6 feet tall by the time I was in 7th grade. I wore thick glasses. I was smart. If that isn't a recipe for social disaster in junior high and high school, I don't know what is. And as soon as I heard Janice Ian's song at 17, I thought, whoa, we have walked in the same moccasins. But then I found out she's only 4'10". When we're together, she barely comes to my elbow. But that song really spoke to me. And so I usually end my presentations by singing her song. In 2008, I was due to be the keynote speaker at a writers' conference in Boise, Idaho. But my husband's bilateral knee replacement surgery, which was supposed to happen in August, got moved up to June. And the weekend, that week, when I was supposed to be in Boise, my husband was supposed to be transferred from the hospital to rehab. And I told my daughters, okay, I'm just going to call him. I'm going to tell the writers' conference, my husband's in the hospital, I can't come. My daughter said, Mom, you gave your word. We'll look after Dad. You keep your promise and go to Boise. Doesn't it just piss you off when your kids start spouting off all of the lessons you taught them when they were little? So I went, muttering under my breath. I was the keynote speaker on Saturday at noon. I finished with Janice's song. Sunday night, when I got back to Seattle, I opened my computer and there was an email from Janice Ian. She said, hey, I heard you sang my song in Boise and that you did a good job of it. It turned out somebody who was a fan of my work and a fan of her work was at the writers' conference, and she went straight back to Nashville and tattled on me. And that's how Janice Ian and I became friends. And a couple of years ago, at the Tampa Bay Book Festival, I got to sing that song as a duet with Janice Ian. And that wasn't easy because she still has her full vocal range. And she said, Judy, you sing in the key of R. And so here, in the key of R, is Janice Ian's iconic song. I learned the truth at 17 that love was meant for beauty queens and high school girls with clear-skinned smiles who married young and then retired. The Valentines I never knew, the Friday night charades of youth were spent on ones more beautiful. At 17 I learned the truth, and those of us with ravaged faces, lacking in the social graces, desperately remained at home, inventing lovers on the phone who called to say, come dance with me, and murmur vague obscenities at ugly girls like me. At 17, a brown-eyed girl in hand-me-downs, whose name I never could pronounce, said, pity please the ones who serve. They only get what they deserve. The rich relation hometown queen marries into what she needs with a guarantee of company. Haven for the elderly. Remember those who win the game lose the love they sought to gain in debentures of quality and dubious integrity. The small-town eyes will gape at you in dull surprise when payment due exceeds accounts received at 17. For those of us who played the game of Valentines that never came, for those whose names were never called when choosing sides for basketball. We all played the game, and when we dare, we cheat ourselves at solitaire, repenting other lives unknown, inventing lovers on the phone who call to say, come dance with me, and murmur vague obscenities at ugly girls like me. At 17, it was long ago and far away. The world was younger than today, and dreams were all they gave for free to ugly duckling girls like me. Thank you for making my dreams come true.